Welcome to another presentation, this time entitled First Folio Frontispiece in Context and in Perspective, Part 1. As I'm sure you're aware, 2023 marks the 400th year since the First Folio was published, and I thought that this would be an appropriate time to take a close look at the frontispiece to try to unravel some of its mysteries. Not the first to try, of course, but there's always a place for a fresh appraisal. Part 1 is short and Part 2 is much longer, with a challenge to orthodox views. It consists of many new ideas. And here it is, the engraving with its accompanying poem, which has perplexed and intrigued generations of scholars ever since it was printed. The idea for what you're about to see came from seeing a short video, likening the engraving to a collage. It seemed to me that it would be possible, with the aid of Photoshop, to investigate some of the claims and criticisms of the work, in particular the apparently impossible doublet. Before we do that, I think it's important to understand the frontispiece in the broader context of the political background at the time. For this I'm going to lean heavily on the work of Roger Strittmatter and Lee Marcus, the references for which and others are to be found in the accompanying PDF. We will also look at the frontispiece from the perspective of other contemporary publications and other works by the engraver. Next, in Part 2, we'll look very closely at the engraving itself and at the accompanying poem by Ben Jonson, in which the name of the author of the works is hidden in plain sight. The poem works on several levels, the most intriguing of which is explained right at the end of Part 2. I believe it to be quite a revelation, so please don't miss it. What was the context in which the folio was published? This was all about politics. The years 1622 and 1623 were ones of great tension in London. The cause was the possible wedding of Prince Charles, the then heir to the Stuart crown, and the Spanish Infanta Maria Anna, sister of King Philip IV. Those in support were Catholics at home and abroad, and King James himself, who looked forward to increasing influence in European affairs, and a resolution of the long-standing struggle between Catholics and Protestants. And then, of course, there was the dowry payable to the crown of some £500,000. Those in opposition were English Protestants led by prominent earls. The fear was of a counter-reformation with the return of Catholicism should the marriage take place. The flames were fanned by the departure for Spain in February of 1623 of Prince Charles and George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, both wearing false beards, to pursue the match. Leading the charge against the marriage in Parliament and the Privy Council were William Herbert, the 3rd Earl of Pembrook, and his brother Philip, Earl of Montgomery, the very same individuals to whom the First Folio was dedicated. William Herbert was also the Lord Chamberlain, and he sponsored a highly satirical play entitled A Game at Chess, which ridiculed the planned wedding by weaving the plot through a series of chess moves. It played at the Globe by the King's Men in 1624, and not surprisingly was a huge success until shut down and the actors arrested. In the play, the White King is James I and the White Knight Prince Charles. The Black King, Philip IV of Spain, and the Black Prince, Gondomar, who was the Spanish ambassador to the English court. The remaining chess pieces were allocated to contemporary characters. In the lower part of the image is depicted a meeting between Gondomar and Prince Charles, with a fat bishop about to take a bribe to return to Catholicism. Against this background, the First Folio was seen as a major political statement and a direct challenge to the King's pro-Spanish policies. It represented all that was English, at peril with integration into Europe. That sounds familiar, of course. Another factor adding to the crisis was the loss of the Protestant control of Palatinate, a part of the Holy Roman Empire. The region was the result of the accumulation of inherited land, and at its centre Heidelberg was staunchly Calvinistic. This was ruled by Frederick V Elector Palatinate and King of Bohemia, which is now part of the Czech Republic, and his wife Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James, remembered as the Winter Queen for her short reign. In 1618, Frederick was offered the crown of Bohemia from the Protestant-dominated Bohemian estates, rather than the conservative Catholic Emperor Ferdinand II. Thus began the 30-Year War, the bloodiest war in Europe history until the 20th century. With 5 to 8 million dead, it was the continuation of the struggles of the Reformation. The Palatinate was invaded by an imperial Spanish army, and in November of 1619 the Protestants lost the Battle of the White Mountain near Prague, the city of which you can see in the distance in this painting. This fine engraving from around 1618 was published by Jans Vischer and shows King Frederick of Bohemia on the left and his replacement Gabriel Bethlen, Prince of Transylvania, on the right. In the distance is the town of Pembrook, now Bratislava in Slovakia. Judging by Bethlen's upturned hand, it's hard not to conclude that he's telling him that the game is up. In 1621, King James dispatched a small contingent, including Henry Rosalie, Henry de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford, and Horatio Vere, to fight on Frederick and Elizabeth's behalf. And here they are in an obvious adaptation of the previous engraving, with Henry Rosalie on the right, ostensibly just a depiction of the two Henrys at war. It had, however, a very different message, which I referred to in a previous presentation. Frederick's battle was unsuccessful, and the couple were deposed and fled to The Hague. The lack of support from the king was seen as a warning of the increasing dominance of the pro-Catholic elements at court, in particular George Villiers and the Spanish ambassador Gondomar. Personally, I think that James was shrewd to keep out of it. He had nothing to gain but everything to lose by committing his forces and being overwhelmed by the Catholics along with the rest of Europe. In England, the leaders of the resistance to the marriage plan consisted of the Earls of Southampton, Oxford, Pembrook, Montgomery and Derby, all of whom had close links to Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. It was the linked families of the De Veres and the Herberts who'd been the strength of the English forces fighting for the Protestant cause in Europe. The brothers Francis and Horatio Vere, cousins to Edward, being the chief military strategists, referred to as the Fighting Veres. By way of an aside, Sir Francis and Sir Horatio were entombed in some splendour at Westminster Abbey. For their cousin, nothing. July 1621 saw the arrest of both of the Earls of Oxford and Southampton for openly opposing the marriage. Oxford was held in the Tower for 5 months. In the meantime, Parliament affirmed freedom of speech and conscience as an undoubted birthright of the subjects of England. An enraged king simply tore it up. After release, Oxford was kept from court by Buckingham. Pembroke's chaplain delivered in March of 1622 a sermon critical of both the marriage and the treatment of Oxford. As a result, Oxford was committed to the Tower for a further 18 months, only to be set free in December of 1623 after the release of the First Folio. Behind the scenes, Gondomar lobbied for his execution as an extremely malicious person. Roger Strittmatter argues very strongly that there's a connection between the marriage crisis and the publication of the First Folio. Both have the same cast and were happening at the same time. The Earl of Pembroke spent his life working to protect the theatre and arts more generally, and from 1615, when appointed as Lord Chamberlain, was the most senior theatre official and had full authority over the King's men and their archives. It was he who in 1619 prohibited the unauthorised publication of plays in the archive. Roger Strittmatter goes on to argue that the manuscripts of the plays were in the hands of the grand possessors, i.e. the descendants and in-laws of Edward de Vere, the political events and the fear of a counter-revolution led them to consider publication of the plays as a demonstration of British values and history, at risk by closer links to the Holy Roman Empire. The printers were well aware of this and anxious to be involved in the process. A strong link between the publisher William Jaggard is evident from a 1619 publication entitled Archaeoplautus, which translates as Ancient Treasures. It's the dedication page, not the contents, which concern us. It's dedicated to Sir Philip Herbert and his wife Lady Susan, the daughter of Edward de Vere. They're invited to enter into a spacious forest, affording all choice of pleasing game, either for hawking, hunting, fishing, fowling, or any other noble exercise beside. You may meet with a fair bevy of queens and ladies at diverse turnings as you walk, and every one will tell you the history of their lives, and fortune as themselves can best, truly, and plainly discourse unto you. Some others also you shall see, sadly sitting under the yew and cypress trees, with garlands of those leaves wreathed upon their heads, sighing out their diverse disasters, whom your noble nature cannot choose but commiserate. Here is the dedication itself, to the most noble and twin-like pair, of truly honourable and complete perfection, Sir Philip Herbert, Knight of the Bath, to our dread Sovereign James, at his royal coronation, Lord Baron of Shirland, Earl of Montgomery, and companion in the unparalleled and famous fellowship of the Order of the Garter, as also to the truly virtuous and noble Countess his wife, Lady Susan, daughter to the Right Honourable Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, Viscount Bulbeck, Lord Sandford of Baldermere, and Lord High Chamberlain of England, etc. Although ostensibly referring to the contents of the current book, Roger Strittmatter opines that it's hard not to equate this to the wonders to be found in a publication of the plays of Shakespeare, the trials and tribulation of the female characters reflecting those of Susan's own life with her father. This view is further enhanced by the dedication page to the First Folio, published just 4 years later, in which the dedication is structured in exactly the same way, but dedicated to the most noble and incomparable brethren, William and Philip Herbert. The year 1621 saw the shift in alliance of Ben Jonson from the Stuarts, with whom he'd been linked for 4 years, to the Pembrook group. Jonson was himself a devout Catholic, so this was not based on religious beliefs. The upshot of this was that he was no longer welcome at court. The movement was of course consistent with his involvement with the First Folio project, such as it was at that stage. This is supported by his being granted by Pembrook the role of Master of the Revels when the current incumbent retired, and a reputed tripling of Jonson's annual Crown pension. In the same year, another publisher by the name of Thomas Walkley entered the scene, apparently directly against Pembroke's edict that no further publications of Shakespeare's work should be made. Walkley registered and published a quarto edition of Othello. It was printed by Nicholas Oakes, a respectable tradesman. On the front page you can see that it was for sale at the Eagle and Child bookshop. It just so happens that this is the emblem of the Earls of Derby. And the emblem still exists on the roof of the family home in Merseyside. Indeed, Walkley frequently published works closely associated with the Earldom of Derby, from the time of his admittance to the Stationers' Company in 1618, including sermons by John Everard, the Derby's controversial chaplain, who was a committed opposer of the Spanish marriage. Towards the end of 1621, and only a month before Othello was published, Everard was jailed for speaking against the Spanish wedding. You will remember in my last presentation that William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, had married Elizabeth de Vere, Edward's eldest daughter, and there's good evidence that the two earls had a close relationship, the implication being that William was one of the possessors of the manuscripts. Roger Stripmatter questions whether the arrest was the catalyst for the publication of Othello. The choice of this play may have an intriguing explanation. Although the play was set in Italy, the villain has a Spanish name, Iago, which is derived from Diego or James. The Spanish ambassador Gondomar was widely perceived to have deviously lured the king to support the Spanish wedding against his better judgment, with a lure of a very large dowry. The pair even referred to themselves as the two Diegos. The play could then easily have been interpreted as a criticism of the current political situation. Printing of the folio is believed to have commenced in March or April of 1622, possibly triggered by the Earl of Oxford's second committal to the Tower and the visit in disguise of Prince Charles and the Earl of Buckingham to Spain. There was an unexpected delay and it was completed in November of 1623. So I think it's possible to make a very good case for those against the Spanish marriage and the king's pro-Spanish agenda in general to be the very same individuals who set out in print the works of Shakespeare. The plan to use the publication of Shakespeare's works to raise the flag for England among the aristocracy, with perhaps an eye to preservation of its contents for future generations. They all knew who Shakespeare was, of course, but Edward de Vere had been airbrushed from history, probably to hide a very dark secret at the centre of Elizabeth's reign. You should remember that this was an expensive book, selling initially for around £1. The production cost was 6 shillings and 8 pence, and the print run was 750 copies. As seems likely, the cost of the project was in the region of £250, and the initial target audience was not bedtime readers of the poor classes. It stood as a testament of what could be lost by being subsumed into Europe. A copy, tucked away in the libraries of the great houses of England and the near continent, would ensure its survival. Those responsible for the publication were of course faced with a problem. William Shakespeare did not exist. It was just a pen name. This is where Ben Jonson, master of ambiguity, had a big role to play. The last thing we need to consider before turning to look at the frontispiece is the term paratext. In a literary sense, this is material surrounding the main text supplied by the authors, editors and printers and publishers. These can act as a guide for the reader in interpretation of the main work. So in the First Folio, the paratext consists of the frontispiece, a eulogy by Ben Jonson, widely believed to have been the editor of the work, a letter to the reader by Hemmings and Condell, the purported editors, again probably written by Jonson, a list of the contents and poems by Leonard Digges and James Mabb, both scholars of Spanish but fervently against the marriage, and finally a list of the principal actors. Each element of the paratext is a study in itself, but the first thing that you see is the engraving of William Shakespeare and Ben Jonson's accompanying poem. We should remember that Ben Jonson was the master of ambiguity. Indeed, he needed to be to keep himself out of trouble. It's not surprising, therefore, that we should be looking out for it in the design of the frontispiece. In earlier presentations, we delved into emblem books by such as Andrea Alciato and Cesare Ripa, each with an allegorical illustration accompanied by an explanatory text. During the latter part of the 16th century, this concept developed into the emblematic frontispiece on publications of importance. These often complex designs allowed poets, dramatists and scholars, and statesmen to express themselves in a second language. It was the task of the reader to try to interpret their meaning. Indeed, in some circumstances, the design was so complex that an explanatory poem was added. There were several types of design, one with a single overall design, one in which the dominant motif was a cartouche, and one which was architectural. The design was usually populated with classical figures relevant to the author and his works. In 1979, Marjorie Corbett and Ronald Lightbourne published a wonderful book entitled The Comely Frontispiece, the emblematic title page from 1550 to 1600, for which I've drawn some examples. Here is the first, the works of James I, published in 1616 and engraved by Reynold Elstrach. It is one of the most complicated architectural designs. At the top are the 4 crowns of James's kingdoms, flanked by their coats of arms, and above the celestial crown to which James aspires. The sun, placed directly above the crowns, represents the deity from which James draws his power. The 2 figures on the left, religion, and on the right, peace, trampling on the weapons of war, the twin goals of James's policies. If nothing else, the frontispiece demonstrates the extraordinary skill of the engravers available in 1616, not only in representing emblematic imagery, but also in portraiture. This is The History of the World by Sir Walter Raleigh, published in 1615, 3 years prior to his execution. Again, highly allegorical and demonstrating a figure, Fama Bona, good news, who has eyes and ears on her wings, and Fama Mala, who is covered with spots, bad news. And this is the one that we're going to look at in some great detail. It's the frontispiece of Ben Jonson's works dated 1616 and engraved by William Hole. Here is everything you might wish to see in a book of works by a famous tragedian. The imagery is complex, and I'll just point out several interesting features. Firstly, there is no image of Ben Jonson himself, but to be fair, he was still alive at the time of publication. At the centre, at the very top, is the figure of tragi-comedy, with sceptre, crown, and jewelled clothes, and slippered feet. At the very top on the left is a tiny figure of Bacchus, the patron of drama, and on the right Apollo, leader of the Muses. And in the very top corners are obelisks, draped in laurel and topped by balls. Almost certainly the theatre is based on Teatro di Marcello, sited next to the Tiber in Rome. It was the largest and most important theatre in ancient Rome, with a capacity of around 20,000, the centre of the classical theatrical world. The theatre fell out of use by 300 AD, but elements survive, and its shape inspired the Sheldonian building in Oxford, designed by Sir Christopher Wren in the 17th century. Below, between the Corinthian columns, are the muses and masks of tragedy on the left, dressed in fine robes, and comedy simply attired to reflect the ordinary people. At the centre is the title of the work, followed by a Latin inscription, which translates as, "I do not work that the crowd may admire me. I am content with few readers." It is a direct quotation from Simone's 110 by this man, Quintus Horatius Flaccus, better known as Horace, who lived in Rome between 65 BC and 8 BC. Jonson, more than any other dramatist of the period, was deeply influenced by Horace, many references to whom are found in his work. Indeed, he translated Horace's The Art of Poetry, which gave advice on the writing of poetry and drama, a work which is to have fundamental influence on Renaissance literature. It was published posthumously in 1640. During his life, Jonson was known as the English Horace. His knowledge of Greek and Latin drama rivaled that of the Latin poet. His own works conceived in the spirit of the classical writers. At the base of the frontispiece are 2 small images. On the left, a cart or plaustrum, with a man inside and being pulled by a donkey. A wine flagon hangs on the side. This is a direct reference to the Greek poet Thespis. The Ars Poetica tells us that Thespis is said to be the first, found out the tragedy and carried it about, till then unknown in carts wherein he did ride. Those that did sing and act their faces dyed with lees of wine. Presumably they'd already consumed the liquor first. On the other side is a hollowed-out amphitheatre in the Greek style. In the traditional performance of the Greek plays, the chorus gathered around the central altar flame with a sacrifice, singing songs about stories from mythology. Apparently, in 534 BC, Thespis stepped away from the others to assume the role of one of the characters of the song, a bold move which brought him to the attention of Aristotle, crediting him with the birth of tragedy. Thespis developed his skills with the addition of masks to denote the different characters. He went on to win the first competition for the best tragedy in the city of Dionysia, and then on to invent the theatrical touring. By this stage, you may be thinking that you've tuned into the wrong video, but there is a point to all of this. I cannot put it more eloquently than Corbett and Lightbound in their book, The Comely Frontispiece. In producing a collected edition of his works, Jonson had engaged an undertaking unprecedented in the world of contemporary drama. The presence of the obelisks, which are monuments, and the laurels that traditionally crown the poet, is surely to signify the author's desire that the folio bring him a poet's immortality. The pictures of the ancient theatre and sentences from Horace proclaim his allegiance to the revered models and precepts of the classical drama and classical poetry by which his works, too learned for the vulgar, have deserved eternal fame. Roll on 7 years and the contrast could not be more stark. The same editor, yet the frontispiece tells us nothing about the man, his works, or his guiding principles. Now why would that be? It surely would have been possible to have dreamt up a few characters from Shakespeare's plays and the odd reference to comedy and tragedy. The answer is that he didn't need to. The engraving and the poem tell us all, if only you know where to look. Apart from rearranging the components, nothing changed right up until the Fourth Folio in 1685. In fact, it wasn't until 1709, in Nicholas Rowe's version, that the bard gets the classical makeover with illustrations. Our next task is to consider the frontispiece in the context of the engraver. The work was carried out by Martin Droeshout. There were two of these, Martin Droeshout the Younger, born in London in 1601, the son of a Flemish engraver, and Martin Droeshout the Elder, his uncle, who was also an engraver and painter. To save my having to shout Droeshout at you in a false Flemish accent, I'm going to refer to him as Martin as much as possible. There's been much debate as to which of the two carried out the work. It may appear odd that the task of providing the engraving for the First Folio should have fallen to one so young, and by implication so inexperienced. Having said that, he would have been 20 or 21 and well beyond the stage of apprenticeship. In 2007, June Schluter reviewed the previous evidence and, using the style and variety of the signatures, the use of monograms and subject matter, concluded that just one engraver, the younger Martin, executed 25 engravings in London beginning in 1623 and ending in Madrid in 1640, after emigrating in 1635. Martin the Elder was born in Brussels in 1573, and a census of 1635 reveals that he'd lived in London with his wife and offspring for 35 years. He is listed as a limner, i.e. a painter of miniatures. As far as I'm aware, there are no extant examples of his engravings. So let's take a look at the evidence that the Shakespeare engraving was indeed engraved by the younger Martin. There's a very good reason for doing this, because, as we shall see later, we have to explain the many idiosyncrasies of the work. We have both signatures and engraved text to help us. There are two engravings dated 1623. This one is an engraving of James, Marquis of Hamilton, clearly labelled as 1623 and bearing the signature Martin D. SC, short for Sculpsit. In the top half of the image we have shining steel, a plume of feathers, and finely worked curtains. Here we have a near-perfect rendition of silk breeches, leather boots, and a velvet tablecloth with shimmering folds. If this engraving were carried out by the younger Martin in the same year as the First Folio work, then it would have a great influence on how we view the latter. Are the inconsistencies that we shall see due to technical error or on purpose? Hard to believe that this print is only 211mm by 157mm, around 8 by 6 inches, about the same size as a paperback book. Could these be by the same engraver? If we make a direct comparison with the First Folio engraving, there is certainly great similarity in the shape of the nose and the mouth. However, the level of skill deployed in the Lord Hamilton image seems to be in a different league. Can we learn anything from the signatures? Unfortunately, the style and weight of the script varies significantly between individual engravings. At the top is a close-up of the First Folio signature. Below is the one from Lord Hamilton. Look closely at this signature. Both the surname is shortened to D and sculpts it to SC. This is not due to lack of space. Having said that, there is a symmetry across the page, and the signature is balanced by the word London in 1623. In later engravings, Martin develops a number of monograms into his signature. In all cases, this allows him to fit the signature into the crowded space around the engraving. This is perhaps the most extreme example from 1639 of Francisco de la Peña, sculpts it in Madrid. You can just see the letters crammed in at the bottom left. The signature is wedged in at the edge of the frame using two abbreviations, MR for Mar and DR for the surname. Martin's later work shows much greater maturity in his technique. Here, from 1533, the poet John Donne is in his shroud. Note the fine detail of the face and the delicate folds of the shroud itself. And here is John Howson, Bishop of Durham, from the 1630s. Note the fine way in which the engraving brings out the reflectiveness of the garments and the detail of the face and beard. So you might think these examples are a result of further development in the engraver's art. I'll leave you to consider whether or not Martin Jr. engraved Lord Hamilton. Somehow, I doubt it. It may, however, have been by his uncle. Before we go on to study the engraving in detail, I want to show you another one, which is all about perspective. The technique of rendering a two-dimensional drawing to give the illusion of 3 dimensions. This is the frontispiece of Montaigne's essays published in 1632. As you can see, a fairly masterful piece of perspective drawing. The engraver? Well, of course it was Martin the Younger. So by this stage, 9 years after the First Folio, Martin certainly knew all about perspective drawing. That concludes part 1 of the presentation on the First Folio. Part 2 takes a very close look at the image and the poem which accompanies it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you will join me for part 2.